Those who need help the most are the ones who don't say anything. The lobby of the shelter was as loud as you'd expect. Dogs barking, excited tails wagging, volunteers wandering around to feed and clean. But in the very last corner of the room, there was one dog that said nothing at all. He lay curled on the same spot he had been since he arrived, a golden retriever with matted fur, dull eyes, and a spirit that had appeared utterly shattered. The shelter workers had done everything: the toys, the treats, the soft words, but nothing seemed to get through to him. He wouldn't even raise his head when someone walked by. "We've seen cases like this before," said Carol, the shelter manager, sighing as she gazed at the inanimate dog. "He's waiting for something, and he knows it, and it's not really clear what it will be, but it's something different about him, or someone. If you don't know me, I don't know you," was an interesting line, and a good line, saying no one knew where he had come from. Animal control had discovered him wandering the streets, gaunt and weary, without a collar or suffix. His body had scars, but only his eyes held the true story, an unrelenting sadness. Sarah, a young volunteer, was irresistibly attracted to him. Every day she watched from afar, her heart aching at the sight of him so still. "Why won't you move? What happened to you?" she muttered under her breath, praying for a miracle. One day, Sarah chose to sit by him, not right next to him, but in his view to let him know she was there. She didn't say a word, just being there, her silent companionship. She went back day after day, book in hand to read, or just sat and sat. The dog didn't react. Not at first. But something in his gaze changed, a fraction of recognition, of curiosity. "So, you're really giving it a go with him, huh?" "I guess so," Carol said, and watched Sarah patiently sit next to the golden retriever. Sarah smiled softly. "I think he needs time. He just needs to know that he's not alone." Carol sighed. "Time isn't necessarily on our side in situations like this." Her voice trailed off, the unarticulated reality lingering in the air. Sarah knew what that meant. Dogs that showed little promise for eventual adoption would often get put on the list. She couldn't let that happen. Not to him. It was a week before anything changed. It was a brief moment, almost a blink, but Sarah saw it. As she sat reading her book, the golden retriever moved, just a little. His paw twitched, his breathing sped up. Sarah's heart leapt. "You're hearing this, aren't you?" she said through tears, stifling a cry. "It's okay, I'm here." His gaze found hers for the first time. It was just a fleeting look, but one that had something in it Sarah hadn't seen before. Hope. Sometimes, all you need to heal is to connect. Daylight shined through the shelter windows, bathing the kennels in a warm light. Sarah came in, softly but surely, clutching a small frayed blanket. Today, she was resolved to make another move toward winning the golden retriever's trust. When she got close enough to his corner, she noticed he was tracking the movement of her eyes, instead of watching her with a blank stare like he always did. A small change, but significant. "Hey, buddy," she said, kneeling next to him. "I brought you something special today." She sat down on the blanket on the ground next to him, leaving him space if he wanted to come interact. The dog didn't spring up immediately, but his eyes stayed on the soft fabric. It hesitated for a while, and then very slowly he stretched forward his nose and sniffed it, very carefully. Sarah held her breath with rapt attention. Then, as though pulled by a long, neglected sense of comfort, the retriever gingerly laid his paw on the lip of the blanket, and for one tiny moment, a flicker of relief and hope sparked in Sarah's heart. "That's it," she said softly and without judgment. "You're safe here. Carol, the shelter manager watched the exchange from near the door. "I think you're getting through to him," she said with a slight smile playing at the edge of her lips. Sarah nodded, still looking at the dog. "It's all about patience. I think he just needs someone who cares about him." Carol huffed, folding her arms. "Well, I hope he gets it together soon. We don't have much time." Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew what Carol meant. Had Sarah, who had so far referred to him as Buddy, not turned him around soon, his future at the shelter would have been questionable. Days went by with little yet meaningful steps forward. Sarah kept sitting with him, reading quietly from her favorite books. When she would talk, Buddy would occasionally raise his head and listen to her, his ears pricking up at the sound of her voice. At other times, he sat still, and Sarah didn't let that stop her. One afternoon, after Sarah sat next to him, Buddy did a thing he'd never done. He stretched his front legs and sighed, slowly, before putting his head on the blanket she had carried with her. Sarah's eyes lit up with hope. "You're doing so good, Buddy," she said softly, her heart swelling with emotion. "One step at a time." Carol walked past, and an approving nod for Sarah. "Do this long enough, and maybe, just maybe, he'll finally get with the program." Sarah approached cautiously, her hand nudging Buddy's paw. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked in her eyes, and for the first time, Sarah felt the armor he had locked himself behind start to crack open. At that moment, she knew they were getting closer. Slow, steady, full of hope. It's okay to take small steps towards change. Any progress is progress. Several days had passed since Buddy had noticed Sarah. Sarah came early each morning to sit with him next to his kennel and speak quietly to him. The shelter was bustling around them. Volunteers ambled by with dogs in tow, and potential adopters came and went. But in that little corner, there were just the two of them. One morning, Sarah showed up with another surprise: a small, stuffed bone. She set it in front of Buddy, carefully monitoring his response. Buddy gazed at the toy, his nose quivering faintly as he smelled the air. When Sarah saw the curiosity from him, she smiled. "It's yours, Buddy. No strings attached." After a long wait, Buddy gently pushed his paw toward the toy, making contact and pulling it toward his chest. Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she blinked away, whispering, "Good boy. You're safe now." Later that afternoon, Carol came over and peered into the kennel. "I see you've made some progress," she said, arms crossed. Sarah grinned. "Yeah, he's learning to trust me. Just a little." Carol nodded. "That's more than anyone else has been able to achieve till now. Keep it up." This encouraged Sarah to keep trying. She brought Buddy little snacks, chatted with him about her day, and told him all the stories of other dogs that found their forever homes. One by one, his body language started to adjust. His ears raised, his eyes no longer gazing but revealing hints of interest. One evening, reading out loud to Sarah, Buddy brought her something amazing. He scooted toward the front of the kennel and put his chin on the bars. Sarah's throat went dry. "You're really trying here, aren't you?" she said softly, extending her hand to stroke his fur through the bars. For the first time, Buddy didn't pull back. The next morning, Sarah arrived with her heart full of newfound hope. Something felt different today. Buddy was already sitting up as she approached the shelter, watching her as she walked to his kennel. "Good morning, Buddy," she said, her heart swelling. From the sidelines, Carol swooped in with a smirk. "You could be just what he needed, Sarah." Sarah beamed. "I believe that he's coming around to that too." When Sarah cracked open the kennel door and slipped inside, Buddy didn't budge. Instead, He sniffed her hand softly, then put his head down on the blanket she had covered him with days before. It was a sign, albeit a small one, that he was starting to trust. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy," Sarah whispered. For the first time, the shelter felt less lonely. It takes time to heal, but even the littlest of signs can help illuminate the path. The shelter's morning routine was just like any other. Volunteers scurried around, barking dogs reverberated throughout the air. But to Sarah, today was different. And as she walked toward Buddy's kennel, she spotted something that made her heart swell. He was sitting up, his eyes bright, watching her walk toward him. Not just watching, waiting. "Hey, Buddy," she said softly, kneeling next to him. "You seem to be beginning to know who I am." Buddy's tail did the faintest wag it had ever done. It was small, barely noticeable, but Sarah noticed. A tiny flicker of trust. She reached out slowly, her hand hovering just beyond the bars. Buddy paused and then pushed his nose forward, sniffing her fingers tentatively. "That's my boy," she said, choking back tears. Buoyed by his success, Sarah took things up a notch. She cracked the kennel door open a bit and sat just inside it, allowing Buddy the option to decide how comfortable he was. He stayed in his normal corner at first, watching her warily. But as the minutes wore on, his curiosity triumphed over his fear. He crept forward, nostrils flaring, catching the scent of Sarah in his familiar surroundings. "You're doing great, Buddy. Take your time," she said gently, voice steady and soothing. Buddy paused, then made another short step. Before Sarah could even register it, he was sitting just inches away from her, with the softest gaze she had ever known. Carol walked by and smiled at the scene. "You have a Midas touch, Sarah. I've never seen him so close with anyone." Sarah smiled back. "It's all about patience. I think he is finally starting to believe that he's much safer." The days that followed were more small victories. Buddy began meeting Sarah with a slow wag of his tail, and when she reached out to pet him, he no longer flinched. He even began eating his meals with her sitting there, something he had previously refused to do. Every morning, Sarah would come to him with food. Little pieces of chicken or a soft biscuit, and Buddy would take the food so delicately from her palm, trusting her more each day. One day, when Sarah was sitting next to him, reading a book out loud, Buddy did something she never expected. He laid his head gently on her knee and sighed from deep in his chest. Sarah stared down, blinking, tears away. "You're finally real, huh?" Carol, looking from across the room, said to another volunteer, "Looks like Buddy's found his human." Weeks turned to months, and Sarah knew they had crossed an invisible line. Buddy had started to trust again, and while the past was still a mystery, the future was starting to look rosy. One evening, when Sarah was about to leave, Buddy got up and walked to the kennel door, his eyes pleading. Sarah went on her knees and placed his face in her palms. "I promise I'll be back tomorrow." Buddy gave her hand a gentle lick, an unspoken offer of solidarity. And for the first time in ages, Sarah walked out of the shelter with hope. Trust is earned, slowly, step by step. Sun streamed through the shelter's windows, filling the kennels with bright light. Sarah came early, as usual, carrying a leash. Today was when she was going to see if Buddy was ready to step outside for the first time. "Hey, Buddy," she said quietly, kneeling in front of his kennel. "Let's do something different today." Buddy, stretched out on his blanket, raised his head at the sound of her voice. The gaping maw of his fear still smoldered in his eyes, but now it had a hint of curiosity. Sarah raised the leash gently, offering him a choice. No pressure, just a little walk," she whispered, holding out a treat. Cautiously, gingerly, Buddy got up. His legs shook slightly, but he moved apprehensively forward. Sarah's heart swelled with pride. When Sarah took Buddy outside, the cool morning air hit his fur, and he stopped to appreciate all of it. It was, after all, the first time he had felt the grass under his paws in what must have been a long, long time. He snuffled the ground, eyes open wide, ears perked. Sarah was patient and gave him time to explore at his own pace. In the distance, other dogs barked and romped, but here, Buddy stayed near Sarah, seeking comfort. "You're doing great, Buddy," she said, slackening the leash. Buddy gradually began to walk. His steps were labored, deliberate, but with each one he conquered. They hadn't walked far from the shelter when Buddy suddenly froze. A loud noise from a passing truck triggered panic in him, and he attempted to retreat. Sarah knelt next to him right away and spoke in a gentle, steady voice. "It's okay, I've got you. Nothing's going to hurt you." She laid her hand softly on his back, sensing his shaking lessen. With some encouragement from Sarah, Buddy took another deep breath and stepped outwards. Sarah smiled. "See? You are stronger than you think." Buddy's steps were steadier by the time they went back to the shelter. He gave a little tail wag and his eyes burned brighter than in weeks. An impressed smile crossing her face, Carol greeted them at the entrance. "Someone's really getting somewhere," Sarah beamed. "One step at a time. I think he's finally starting to believe." When Sarah unhooked the leash, Buddy licked her hand gently, his way of thanking her. That evening, as Sarah walked out of the shelter, she was beaming. For the first time, she felt that Buddy might have a chance at a new life. Where patience and kindness meet, trust grows. What followed were days of newfound energy, beginning with Buddy's first walk. Every morning, Sarah came with the same gentle greeting, and every morning Buddy greeted her with a hopeful wag of his tail. "Hey, Buddy! About to undertake another adventure today?" she said, waving the familiar leash. Buddy paused for a second and then stepped forward, looking decidedly less stiff than he had just a moment before. Sarah snapped the leash to his collar and gave him an encouraging smile. "Let's go at your pace." Out in the shelter's courtyard, Buddy appeared more relaxed. He sniffed the grass. His ears twitched at the sound of chirping birds. He even stopped to watch the other dogs playing nearby, which he wouldn't have done a week ago. Smiling, Carol watched from the entrance to the shelter. "I believe he's finally starting to have fun with life again." Sarah beamed. He just needed a little time and somebody to believe in him. This time, they walked farther, onto a nearby trail through trees. Buddy's steps were more certain, tail waving gently. Sarah continued to speak in a light, chirpy voice as she praised him with every new step. "See, Buddy? The world's not so bad after all," she said, scratching behind his ears. Still, despite everything, there were times of uncertainty for Buddy. A jogger went past and startled him, and he shrank back, burrowing into Sarah's side. She immediately knelt down, whispering, "It's okay, you're safe." With big, slow breaths, Buddy calmed himself, and Sarah allowed him to collect himself before she continued. "It all makes a difference," she gently reminded him. Later, another shelter volunteer, Mark, jogged up to them. "Hey, I saw Buddy out here." "He's doing amazing." Sarah grinned. "Yeah, he's come a long way." But that evening, back inside the shelter, Sarah noticed something was different. Instead of retreating to the back of his kennel like he usually did, Buddy stayed near the front, his eyes expectant. Sarah sank to her knees, her heart swelling. Are you waiting for me now?" Buddy butted her hand, and Sarah got a lump in her throat. "You're ready for a home, aren't you, Buddy?" Carol walked over and patted Sarah's shoulder. "I believe it's time we begin searching for the right family." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Yeah, I think so too." Buddy gazed up at her with a quiet confidence that wasn't there before. Every heart has a home. The shelter throbbed with its usual activity. Volunteers searching for the dogs, potential adopters exploring the kennels. But for Sarah, today was different. Today, she and Carol would begin the search for Buddy's forever home. Sarah crawled next to Buddy's kennel and scratched his ear. The agency connects families and can find them the perfect one, a pitch for a bowway, to ones looking to adopt. Buddy, more trusting now, wagged his tail slowly and leaned into her touch. It was a testament to how far he had traveled from the scared, silent dog he used to be to the hopeful companion sitting next to her now. Carol came up to her, holding a clipboard and flipping through the stack of adoption applications. "We've already had a couple of inquiries about Buddy," she said, smiling. "Some promising ones, too." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Really? Who's interested?" Carol paged through the papers. "There's a retired couple who wants a quiet dog to keep them company, and a family with older children who could help with rescue dogs." Sarah weighed each option in her mind. "He requires a calm environment with people who understand his pace." Carol nodded. "We'll arrange a few meet and greets and see how he does." The first was the retired couple and the Harrisons. They were thoughtful, nice, and patient. Mrs. Harrison sat on the floor and allowed Buddy to come to her on his own terms. "Hello, sweet boy," she said in a soft voice. "You're such a handsome son of a gun." Buddy paused, then made his way toward her tentatively, sniffing her hand. Sarah watched in hope and anxiety. After a few minutes, Buddy lay next to her, half closing his eyes. "He likes you," Sarah said, feeling relief wash over her. Mr. Harrison chuckled. "We'll take good care of him, don't you worry." Sarah meets with Carol later that evening to discuss the meetings. The Harrisons were awesome, but Buddy was a little nervous with the kids from the other family. Carol nodded. "Sometimes it takes time. We are not looking to do it immediately." Sarah sighed, brushing her hand through Buddy's fur. "All I want is what works best for him." Carol put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You've already done him so much good, Sarah. Trust the process." Buddy appeared more comfortable with the Harrisons a few days later, following a second visit. Sarah looked as he delicately took a treat from Mrs. Harrison's hand and wagged his tail in a way that melted her heart. "I think this is it," Sarah whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "He's found his family." Carol smiled. "Well, then let's make it official." As Sarah signed the adoption documents, Buddy gazed up at her with a pensive wisdom, as if he realized he just had made a journey to a place where he belonged. Every journey starts with a step, and every home with an open heart. The day had finally arrived. Buddy's adoption papers signed, his clothes packed in a small bag, his favorite blanket, a few toys, and a packet of treats. Sarah was standing next to the Harrisons' car, which was parked on the side of the road, watching as Buddy sniffed at the open door. "Let's go, Buddy," Mr. Harrison said softly, clinging to the leash with restraint. Buddy paused to glance back at Sarah, confusion strewn across his features. She sank to her knees beside him, stroking his fur. "It's okay, Buddy. You're going to be so loved here." Buddy paused for a moment, before breathing in deep and climbing into the car. Sarah returned the gesture, blinking back tears as the car drove away. His first few days in his new home were spent exploring carefully. Buddy explored the Harrisons' comfortable home, his nose quivering at every new smell. The soft couch, the warmth from the fireplace, and the quiet of the backyard were all novel. Mrs. Harrison knelt on the floor, offering him treats and soft words of encouragement. "Take your time, sweetheart." Buddy lay curled on his new dog bed, cuddling his old blanket, the one Sarah had given him at night. It did smell like her, and it made the transition just a little easier. Slowly but surely, Buddy started to trust his new environment. He trailed Mr. Harrison around the house, his tail gently wagging on their neighborhood walks. He took solace in the familiar ritual of meals and gentle pats on his head. One afternoon, Mrs. Harrison was reading in her living room when Buddy tentatively rested his head on her lap. She looked down at him and smiled, gently stroking his fur. "You're home now, Buddy," she said as she clasped his hands. A week after the adoption, Sarah visited. Buddy's eyes lit up the second she walked through the door. He dashed to her, tail wagging furiously, burrowing into her hands. Sarah laughed, her eyes glistening with tears. "I missed you too, Buddy." The Harrisons smiled warmly. "He's been doing so well. We're so thankful for all you did for him." She knelt and kissed the top of Buddy's head. "I knew you had it in you all along." And as Sarah walked out the door that day, she felt a sense of calm wash over her, knowing Buddy had finally found the home he'd always deserved. Seeing him flourish in his new existence filled her heart with joy and gave her a reminder of why she had begun volunteering at the shelter in the first place. Buddy watched her go through the window, but he didn't look sad this time. Instead, they held gratitude. Each victory, no matter how small, is a step toward a more joyful existence. Buddy's new life slowly settled into a comforting routine. Every morning he waited by the back door to go for a walk with Mr. Harrison. The previously timid retriever now marched proudly down the sidewalk, ears up, eyes peering around at everything, burgeoning with curiosity. "Good boy, Buddy," Mr. Harrison said with a laugh as Buddy enthusiastically sniffed a patch of flowers. The change was gradual but unmistakable. It took time, but the fear that had once dominated Buddy was subsiding, and in its place, trust and belonging. One afternoon, the Harrisons took Buddy to a park close to their home. It was a huge leap. New faces, new dogs, new sounds. Buddy was skittish at first, tail tucked a little between his legs. Sarah, who had accompanied him on the outing, knelt next to him. "It's okay, Buddy. You're safe. Just take your time." Breathing in deeply, Buddy stepped tentatively onto the grassy field, with Sarah patting his back reassuringly. He crept forward slowly, his nose twitching. A golden retriever from across the park bounded into Buddy's path, and Buddy momentarily froze. And then, suddenly alive again, he wagged his tail and barked innocently. Sarah looked at her in shock. "Did you see that? He's playing." Mrs. Harrison dabbed at a tear. "He's finally learning how to be happy again." In the days that followed, Buddy was more expressive. He'd bark softly in excitement when it was time for his walk, and his tail wagged wildly whenever Sarah came to visit. One morning, as Mr. Harrison poured food into Buddy's bowl, Buddy nudged his hand and emitted a soft, happy bark. "Would you look at that?" Mr. Harrison laughed. He's finally found his voice. And so Buddy's transformation was not only one of adaptation, it was one of lost joy, found. One evening, Sarah sat on the Harrisons' porch watching the sunset, the dog Buddy lying next to her, his head on her lap. "You did it, Buddy. You found your home," she whispered, stroking his fur. Buddy sank down, sighing deeply, his body relaxed, his heart full. He was home. It's good that life is a journey, and so is love, siguiente estación. Life in his new home was starting to feel like home for Buddy. He had gotten accustomed to his new routine, loved long strolls with Mr. Harrison, and took solace in Mrs. Harrison's gentle touch. But just when everything seemed perfect, a moment rather fatal for this finalist arose. One morning, he wouldn't eat breakfast. He sat next to his bowl, his eyes far away, his tail motionless. Mrs. Harrison knelt, worry registering on her face. "What's wrong, Buddy? You've been doing so well." Sarah visited and immediately noticed the difference. She knelt down next to him, caressing his fur. "Something seems wrong with him today," she said quietly, sharing a look of concern with Mrs. Harrison. The Harrisons immediately took Buddy to the vet. In the waiting room, Mr. Harrison stroked Buddy's back soothingly. "You're going to be okay, Buddy. We're here for you." A gentle look came on the vet after a full checkup. "He's good, but maybe some stress or something like that." So even with all the progress he's made, big changes can stir old fears. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief but still had a twinge of concern. What can we do to help him feel safe again? The vet gave them some tips, keeping to the same routine, providing him with a little extra reassurance, and most of all, patience. At home, Sarah and the Harrisons were a team, joining forces to adjust Buddy back into comfort. They added new things to do, from softer playtime in the backyard to more snuggling on the couch. Sarah felt compelled to convince Buddy that it was okay to be scared, even though she was quaking in her boots herself that very night right next to him. "But you are safe here, and we are not leaving." Buddy sighed heavily and leaned against her, offering a small, comforting wag of his tail. Days went by, and slowly, Buddy started coming back to himself. He welcomed Mr. Harrison at the door with enthusiasm, trailed Mrs. Harrison around the house, and once more looked forward to his daily walks. One morning, when Sarah came for her daily visit, Buddy raced up to greet her, his eyes bright, his spirit willing. "That's my boy," she said, laughing as she knelt down to embrace him. Carol, who had returned to check on Buddy's progress, smiled. "He's come a long way, and it's all thanks to you." Buddy gained confidence with each passing day, and all of his new family's love and tolerance had helped him climb yet another mountain. Watching him play in the backyard, Sarah knew his road was long, but that with the Harrisons behind him, there was so much ahead. Healing doesn't mean you won't be scared again. It means learning to trust even when you're terrified. Buddy's confidence built every day, little by little. He was no longer tentative about going out, and his once cautious tail wags had grown into full-out happy wags. One sunny afternoon, Sarah stopped by the Harrisons and found Buddy with his tail wagging in front of the door, excited that she had come to see him. "Looks like someone's ready for a walk." Sarah smiled, waving his leash around. Mr. Harrison chuckled. "He's been expecting you all morning. You've really made a difference, Sarah." Sarah fastened the leash around Buddy's collar and guided him on the path to the park they knew so well. This time, Buddy walked alongside her, striding confidently, his eyes exploring the world around him with curiosity rather than fear. Buddy also encountered new people, sights, and sounds at the park. A little girl sprinted up to give him a pat, and Sarah held her breath, fearing he'd pull away. But to her surprise, Buddy refused to budge, his tail wagging warily. "You're a good boy," the little girl said, giving him scratches behind his ears. Buddy closed his eyes, leaned into the gentle touch. Sarah could feel pride swelling in her heart. "It's incredible, Buddy. You're amazing." As they continued walking, a loud clap of thunder echoed across the sky. Buddy stiffened, his body becoming rigid. Sarah kneeled next to him, saying calming words. "It's okay, Buddy. You're safe." Buddy did not retreat, but looked up at Sarah, searching for assurance in her eyes. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, marching on through his fear with new determination. Mr. Harrison, who watched from a nearby bench, smiled. "He trusts you, Sarah, and that was the best gift you could have given him." Later that evening, Buddy snuggled next to Mrs. Harrison as she read by the fireplace. His eyes were calm, his breathing was steady. He was home, truly home. Sarah came to sit next to him, reaching out to stroke his fur. "You've come so far, Buddy, and I could not be more proud of you." Agreeing was Carol, who had come around to check in. "He's no longer a shelter dog. He's family." It was a heavy, sweet smile that weighed her down with happiness. "Yeah, he is. Maximum time does not equal better healing, but rather, it is the love and understanding that walks alongside a person." Buddy's transformation was miraculous. The nervous, timid retriever was now roaming the house with a sense of belonging. The tail wagged freely, and the eyes sparkled with a light Sarah could have only dreamed of seeing when she first met him. On a bright, crisp morning, Sarah came to the Harrisons' house, and there was Buddy waiting by the window, waiting for her. As soon as she got out of her car, his tail thumped furiously against the floor. "I guess you're happy to see me, huh?" Sarah smiled as she walked in and bent down to say hi to him. Buddy replied with an affectionate nuzzle, pushing his head into her hands. Mr. Harrison laughed in response from his armchair. "I think you're part of the family now, Sarah." Sarah smiled, a warm sense of pride swelling inside her chest. "He's come such a long way." That afternoon, Sarah and the Harrisons took Buddy hiking along a nearby forest trail. It was a challenge he had graduated to. New scents, new sounds, and a world much bigger than the shelter that had been his home. Initially, Buddy remained near Sarah's side, his ears perking up at the sound of rustling leaves and chirping birds. But as they continued deeper into the woods, his confidence increased. He started sniffing tree trunks and bounding ahead with glee. Mrs. Harrison laughed. "Look at him go! I can't believe it's the same dog." Sarah nodded. "He's learning how to trust the world again." They encountered a quiet clearing halfway through their hike. Buddy joined Sarah's side, panting softly. A look of serene bliss swept across his face as he scanned his surroundings. "I think he's finally found his place," Sarah said. Even with all that progress, there were still times when the past seeped in. A loud noise in the distance, maybe a car backfiring, caused Buddy to freeze. His body tensed with anxiety. Sarah crouched beside him, her hand on his back. "It's okay, Buddy. I'm here." Buddy's eyes searched hers for reassurance, and finally, he released a deep breath and relaxed. He had learned that he wasn't alone in his fear anymore. "That's it," Sarah whispered. "You're safe now." The Harrisons took in the moment in quiet awe, knowing how many years of love and patience had gone into getting Buddy to this place. As the days went by, Buddy's life kept blossoming. He discovered happiness in simple pleasures: a morning stroll with Mr. Harrison, a peaceful afternoon snooze resting against the fireplace, and unfettered games of fetch in the yard. The dog that had long ignored Sarah now barked excitedly every time Sarah came home. Sarah felt fulfilled one evening while having tea with the Harrisons and watching Buddy chomping on his favorite toy. "I don't even have the words to thank you for giving him a second chance," she said, facing Mrs. Harrison. Mrs. Harrison smiled warmly. "It is Buddy who has given us more than we could have ever dreamed." Sarah gazed at Buddy, who was curled up happily next to the fireplace, and she realized that his journey had never been just about survival. It had been about love, about family, and about belonging somewhere that was home. Home is not just a place. It's where you are loved unconditionally. The following weeks were warm and quiet joy. Buddy had thoroughly settled in with the Harrisons and had finally found his forever home. The previously scared dog was walking with confidence. If he was avoiding going from room to room, it wasn't out of fear, and he was able to run in the backyard with his tail up. One morning, Sarah came to visit and heard the familiar sound of Buddy's paws clicking on the hardwood floor. The moment she walked in the door, Buddy bounded toward her with bright eyes, his tail beating against the furniture. "Hey, Buddy!" Sarah laughed and knelt down to hug him. "You're looking so happy." Mrs. Harrison glowed from the kitchen. "He's really part of the family here now, Sarah. We can never thank you enough for believing in him." Tears pooled in Sarah's eyes. "He's the one who believed in us." Buddy brought something new every day. From the mischief he created in the yard to the way he jumped up and down, desperately wanting to go on a walk each morning, or ended every day curled up on a rug in front of the fireplace. He had become a fixture in the home. On one such evening, after they all sat down for a meal, Buddy placed himself next to the table and watched every bite every member took. Mr. Harrison laughed and dropped a small piece of chicken into his mouth. "Just this once, okay?" Buddy wagged his approval, and the whole family laughed. Sarah reclined in her chair, soaking it all in. "You were always meant to be here, weren't you, Buddy?" One afternoon, Sarah and the Harrisons chose to take Buddy back to the shelter, not to stay, but to visit the volunteers who cared for him at his lowest. Carol's face lit up as they walked through the doors. "Buddy, look at you." Buddy trotted over, body language relaxed and happy, a far cry from the trembling dog who wouldn't move a muscle. "You've done amazing things with him," Carol told them, tears welling in her eyes. "It's moments like these that make everything we do worth it." Sarah got down on her knees and hugged Buddy. "You're an inspiration, Buddy. You've taught us all that second chances are worth fighting for." Driving back home, Sarah looked out the window, her heart swelling. "I think it's time we helped more dogs like Buddy," she said, looking at Mrs. Harrison. Mrs. Harrison nodded. "I was thinking the same thing. Perhaps we can volunteer together." Buddy, snuggled in the back seat, sighed contentedly. He had found a home for life, and now Sarah wanted to show everyone else how. That night, Buddy lay on his favorite blanket, his eyes half closed as the fire crackled softly. Sarah had sat next to him, rubbing his fur. "You did it, Buddy," she said softly. "You found where you belong." Buddy gave a little sigh of contentment, and his tail thumped once on the floor. He was finally home. When one door closes, another opens, bringing hope and opportunities beyond your imagination. Life had settled into a glorious rhythm for Buddy and the Harrisons. Every day they found more laughs and more love to share, and their home became a temple of happy joy. Buddy not only had a place where he was safe, but a place where he was truly loved. One bright morning, Sarah came with a new idea in her mind. While watching Buddy frolic in the backyard, inspiration struck. "Mrs. Harrison, did you ever think about fostering another dog?" Sarah said, a light of hope in her eyes. Mrs. Harrison appeared to be chewing on that. "Fostering? I don't know. Buddy's grown so much. Would he be all right with another dog? Sarah crouched beside Buddy and patted his fur. I don't think he'd have ever withered under the light you've put on him. He's learned so much. Maybe he can do for another dog what was done for him. Overhearing the conversation, Mr. Harrison joined in. It's worth a shot. If Buddy can act as a role model for another dog in need, why not? A week later, Carol from the shelter came with a shy young Labrador called Daisy. She was fight instead of flight and wouldn't trust using anyone. A reminder of Buddy's early days. Buddy dived in to investigate as Daisy entered the house slowly. He walked slowly over, tail wagging slightly, and sat a few feet from her, giving her space. "Look at that," Sarah said under her breath. "He's telling her that it's okay." Daisy paused, but when Buddy rolled over and gave a slight wag, she stepped forward. The affinity was immediate. Buddy, who had been the frightened rescue, was now a source of comfort to someone else. The next few weeks were a series of small but significant moments. Buddy led Daisy through her fears, showing her by example how to trust. He would accompany her during mealtime, urge her on during walks, and share his favorite spot by the fireplace. One night, Sarah saw Buddy nudge a toy over to Daisy, inviting her to play. Daisy gave a little bark of excitement for the first time. "He's teaching her how to be a dog again," Mrs. Harrison said with a smile. Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she observed Buddy mentoring Daisy. It was like this full circle thing happening. That retriever who had been broken and mute was now a light for others. "I feel like Buddy has found his true self," Sarah said one afternoon as Buddy and Daisy played in the yard. Mrs. Harrison nodded. "And we can thank you for that, Sarah." That evening, Sarah walked to her car and looked back at Buddy and Daisy curled together in the yard. It was a scene of hope, resilience, and love. "We're going to keep doing this," she told herself. One dog at a time. Driving away, she couldn't stop smiling. Buddy had a story of his own, but it also became part of JB's story too. His home wasn't just about a roof over his head. Every end is a new beginning. As the sun sank below the horizon, dappling the Harrisons' backyard in a warm, golden glow, Sarah sat on the porch, watching Buddy and Daisy romp. No more timid golden retriever. That one had become the symbol of durability, and now was passing the torch to another one in need. "He looks so happy," Mrs. Harrison said, emerging from the doorway with a cup of tea. "I can't believe how far he's come." Buddy bumped Daisy with his nose, then waved a stick at Daisy as he saw her and wagged his tail, while a smile rose on Sarah's face. "I've always known he had this in him. He simply needed time and love." From then on, Buddy's days were filled with joy, companionship, and love. Whether it was early morning strolls with Mr. Harrison, quiet moments spent with Mrs. Harrison next to the fireplace, or silly afternoons playing with Daisy, every day was a reminder of how far he'd come. Helen came home one afternoon to discover Buddy sitting at the front door, waiting for her. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and he greeted her with a gentle wag of his tail and a cheery woof. "Hey, Buddy," she said quietly, kneeling to pet him. "I've got some good news." Mrs. Harrison came forward. "Sarah's going to be doing more with the shelter, helping dogs just like you." Buddy wagged his tail as though he understood, and Sarah choked up. "You've inspired me, Buddy. Thanks to you, many more of these dogs will be given a second chance." It was the time Sarah had to say bye for the day, but it seemed different this time. When she kneeled down beside Buddy, he placed his head on her shoulder and sighed smoothly. "I'll always be here for you, Buddy," she whispered. "No matter what." Mrs. Harrison brushed away a tear. "He's found his forever home, Sarah." thanks to you." Sarah rose, giving Buddy a glance back as she walked to her car. But she realized that while Buddy's story at the shelter had ended, his journey wasn't over. He had found home, and in that, he had found himself. Back at the shelter, Sarah glanced at the other dogs trying to find homes. The transformation inspired her, and she vowed never to stop working to ensure that every dog ends up with a forever home. Walking through past the kennels, she smiled at a young shepherd mix who wagged his tail timidly. She knelt down and told him, "Don't worry, little guy. Your journey starts now." And with that, a new story of hope, patience, and love began.